Part 1. The Shadow of 1943. A trauma that reshaped a nation. In 1943, one of the most devastating humanitarian disasters in South Asian history unfolded, the Bengal Famine of 1943. An estimated 3 million people perished. This was not merely the result of crop failure, but a convergence of wartime policies, market panic, administrative neglect, and colonial priorities. At the time, India was under British rule, and the world was engulfed in World War II. Food supplies, transportation networks, and shipping resources were heavily redirected toward the war effort. Rice production in Bengal declined, but the catastrophe deepened due to hoarding, speculation, inflation, and the absence of timely relief. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later faced intense criticism for his government's response, which many historians argue failed to prioritize Indian civilian lives. The famine left more than physical devastation. It embedded a permanent trauma into the national psyche. The lesson was clear. Political freedom meant little without food security. This tragedy planted the seed of a powerful idea that food sovereignty must become central to India's future. Part 2. Independence and the birth of a control state. When India gained independence in 1947, its leaders were determined that such a disaster would never happen again. Food was no longer seen merely as a commodity. It became a pillar of national security. To prevent hoarding and stabilize prices, the government introduced strict regulatory frameworks. One of the most significant was the Essential Commodities Act, which empowered the state to regulate production, storage, distribution, and pricing of essential goods. A centralized procurement system was developed. The government began purchasing wheat and rice from farmers at fixed prices. Large storage facilities were built, and a structured public distribution system emerged to supply subsidized grain to citizens. Thus, colonial-era neglect was replaced by a highly centralized, state-managed food economy, a system that continues to influence agricultural markets today. Part 3. The high-stakes gamble of the Green Revolution. By the 1960s, India was once again facing food shortages. The country relied heavily on imported grain. Living in what observers described as a shipped-mouth existence, food arriving by sea was consumed almost immediately, with little buffer stock. Under this pressure, India embraced radical agricultural reform known as the Green Revolution in India. High-yield varieties of wheat and rice were introduced, along with chemical fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, and expanded irrigation. The results were dramatic.
Grain production surged, and India moved towards self.
However, the revolution came with long-term trade-offs. Soil degradation, falling groundwater levels, and declining crop diversity became growing concerns. Yet at the time, fear overrode caution. The memory of 1943 made food abundance the overriding priority, even at ecological cost. Part 4. The concrete legacy of rice and wheat over time. Wheat and rice became the backbone of India's agricultural policy. The minimum support price (MSP) mechanism ensured that farmers would receive guaranteed prices for these crops, encouraging consistent production. The government annually procured vast quantities of grain and stored them in large silos. What began as an emergency response to famine gradually evolved into a permanent economic and political structure. However, this system also locked India into a water-intensive, cereal-focused model. Even as dietary preferences diversify and climate change intensifies water scarcity, policy inertia continues to favor wheat and rice. The infrastructure built to survive wartime vulnerability became the enduring blueprint of India's grain economy. Part 5. Modern Ripples. 2026 protests, and the path forward in 2026. Renewed farmer mobilizations and intense debates over agricultural deregulation once again brought India's food system into the national spotlight. Although the context is modern, involving private markets, agri-tech platforms, contract farming, and global exports, the emotional and political undercurrent traces back to a much older memory, the trauma of the Bengal Famine of 1943. For many farmers, state procurement, buffer stocks, and guaranteed pricing are not merely economic tools, they are safeguards against historical catastrophe. The fear of market volatility revives concerns about food, insecurity, and systemic neglect. On the other hand, reform advocates argue that rigid controls, heavy cereal bias, and inefficient storage systems are no longer sustainable in a climate-stressed, globally integrated economy. India today faces a complex balancing act, preserving the safety net created after independence, reducing overdependence on water-intensive wheat and rice, encouraging crop diversification and climate-resilient farming, integrating technology, data, and sustainable practices into agriculture. The tension is not simply about economics. It is about trust. Trust in markets versus trust in the state. Trust shaped by history. To understand why India remains deeply cautious about fully liberalizing agriculture, one must recognize how deeply the events of 1943 scarred the national consciousness. The famine was not just a failure of food supply. It was a failure of governance. That memory continues to influence policy decisions, farmer movements, and political rhetoric. Conclusion: the ghost that still guides the grain. India's agricultural system was not built in isolation. It was forged in the shadow of war, famine, and national rebuilding. From strict regulatory laws to the Green Revolution and the MSP framework, each policy layer reflects a single unspoken vow: never again. Yet the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, groundwater depletion, shifting diets, and global trade pressures demand adaptation. The very structures that once ensured survival must now evolve to ensure sustainability. The future of India's food identity lies not in abandoning its past, but in understanding it. Only by acknowledging how deeply 1943 shaped policy can India confidently redesign its agricultural model for a changing world. The ghost of famine still lingers, but it can